5 years ago, a bombshell article came out called "It Wasn't Just Greece. Archaeologists Find Early Democratic Societies in the Americas." According to the article, there is increasing evidence that certain states in Mesoamerica before the Spanish conquest were not ruled by kings, but by senates and other institutions normally associated with democratic rule. Now, this seemed to go against the traditional narrative that democracy started in ancient Greece, was later revived in Europe, and from there was spread to the rest of the world. So, what's the deal here? Was democracy really more widespread in ancient times than previously thought? That's what we're going to find out today. Hi, I'm Lantern Jack, and in today's episode of Ancient Greece Declassified, we're looking at a new book that is challenging the standard history of democracy. It's called The Decline and Rise of Democracy, and it goes much further than the article mentioned from 5 years ago. Its author, David Stasavage, collects and presents evidence for many premodern, non-European democracies, and argues that democracy has been around since time immemorial. David Stasavage is the Dean for Social Sciences and a professor of political science at NYU, and he joins us now. David Stasavage, welcome to Ancient Greece Declassified.
Thank you for having me, Jack.
So when did you first start to question the traditional narrative that democracy began in ancient Greece and then spread from Europe to the rest of the world?
Well, it took a long time. I've been primarily working on the development of European state institutions from the Middle Ages onwards, and that's what a lot of the early part of my career I spent doing, and particularly the development of representative assemblies. And I was asked to do a review essay for the Annual Review of Political Science back in 2016 or 15, I guess, is when I wrote it. And I tried to ask why Europe was exceptional or unique in having governance by consent. And while there are some aspects of the European story that are unique, and we can talk about this later, I soon realized after I published that piece that maybe other societies had institutions of consent where rulers of one sort or another needed to seek input and consent from their people. And so I realized in that review essay that I had gotten the story wrong. And so what I did then was set about thinking about writing a book on this topic that would start off from the presumption, based on evidence, that a lot of societies independently developed consent-based procedures, might even call it democracy, and then question why some societies took that path and continued on that path as opposed to going down a path of developing an autocracy.
Right. So as you mentioned, you might not be the first person to advocate this perspective on history, but I think your book is the biggest collection of all the evidence to date that I'm aware of. And since you have that database in your mind of all these examples, I was wondering if you could give us maybe your favorite case of a pre-modern democracy that people should know about.
Well, I mean, the favorite case that I really enjoyed reading about, and this is because we have so much material, is the Huron, or the people who once lived in present-day Ontario, who called themselves the Wendat. And I got interested in them by reading the work of Bruce Trigger, who was a well-known specialist of the Huron, and found out that, interestingly, when the Jesuits, French Jesuits, first went to New France, as they called it, in the 17th century, that they set about recording and noting down things about the peoples that they were encountering, and they sent large numbers of volumes of these chronicles back to Paris, and we have them as a record today. And of course, they have to be treated carefully because these are outsiders, Europeans with a particular axe to grind, who might have a specific thing to say about these societies, sometimes in a negative light. But at least with respect to their politics, that wasn't usually the case. Interestingly enough, their description of just how, I would say, democratic the society of the Huron was in terms of having councils at the local village level, at the level of a tribe, and then the level of a confederation. And it's a style of politics that is, in fact, very similar to the group that most people know as the Iroquois, who called themselves the Haudenosaunee.
So wait, so the Huron and the Iroquois, they had similar governmental structures? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think they got the idea from each other, or were these independent developments?
Well, for two societies that interacted and were that close together, you would think it was probably a broader development. But certainly beyond those two, they had a style of governance that was quite exceptional, I think. And what was exceptional among them is that a lot of early societies had what I call early democracy, where the ruler needed to rule jointly with a council, perhaps even a council having broad representation. But that was something that was most often a local phenomenon. It didn't become a general phenomenon for a larger scale once a society scaled up so that it was covering a larger territory. And to an extent, the Huron and the Iroquois were successful in maintaining consensual governance at scale. Not at the scale of something like the U.S. or Canada today, but at a fairly large scale for a pre-modern society.
So no kings, no absolute rulers here. Just like who were the rulers? Who were the leaders of these societies?
No absolute rulers. Chiefs, but chiefs that could be deposed. Could be deposed by female clan heads, interestingly enough. So a prominent role for women in politics, even in these societies, even if women didn't actually sit in the councils. That was a pretty strict norm that didn't happen. But they were influential in this way in terms of being able to depose chiefs, for example, and in other informal and indirect types of participation.
And you mentioned that it's a kind of confederation. Does that mean that, so you have a bunch of, I guess, local villages that come together for a political unit, but is there a political head of state for all the villages, or does each tribe maintain its own autonomy?
Yeah, there would be various chiefs, and this is something that resembles other societies around. But what was specific about both of these confederations was a little bit like the Articles of Confederation in the United States, where each state could not participate if it didn't want to in something. So there was a general norm, unlike in a contemporary society, that if your tribe wasn't happy with it, you could just opt out or move out or something. Nothing was binding, but there nonetheless was collective decision making.
Okay. Now, when you talked about the Wendat and the Iroquois structure, you mentioned that it was exceptional, which suggests, or that kind of implies that even though you're saying on the one hand that early democracy was widespread globally, it still was exceptional within its own within the various regions of the world. Is that true? So
I think exceptional that it existed at scale was rare, so that it was much more common in smaller scale societies than in large scale societies, and there were some societies that succeeded in maintaining it even as they scaled up, so that they formed a confederation of however many tribes instead of one, but that was less common. And that's going to come on to the issue of ultimately what Europeans were really exceptional at was taking a form of consensual governance that a lot of other societies had practiced, but scaling it up to the level of something on the scale of a contemporary nation state.
I see. So as you mentioned in your book, every society, every regime, even the most autocratic regimes, they need to have at least a semblance of consent by the people, right? So a lot of monarchies in history had some rituals or structures that seemed to at least give the impression that the people could approve or offer consent to the ruler. So I guess, where do you draw the line when you look at these early societies? Where do you draw the line between democracy and what you call the autocratic alternative?
Yeah, and I think that's going to depend. One has to look very carefully at exactly how the procedures went and how they organized themselves. So there have been many examples where someone becomes a new ruler. such as, say, for example, when we had with King Charles taking over, and he became ruler after there was a meeting of the Accession Council, or Accession Council, I guess. Now, that council wasn't going to decide, yay or nay. That was just a sort of formulaic thing. Things like that have existed in a lot of societies where people will come to acknowledge that this is a new ruler, and that's it. And after that, you're done. But I think that's a very different style of rule compared to one where a ruler maybe gets approved by the populace, or maybe at least by elites in society, but then the ruler continues to consult in councils after that point, and feels a sense that these councils can actually constrain their decision-making somehow, so that they're not able to just act on a whim and do whatever they want. And that's the more democratic route.
I see. So let's move a little bit south to Mesoamerica. Now, the famous civilizations of the area, the Aztecs and the Maya, are usually thought of as, strong autocratic regimes. But you also talk about more democratic types of regimes in the area. So could you talk about what the evidence there is?
Yeah. So the Aztec, or Triple Alliance, as they called themselves, was actually a very interesting structure that became autocratic over time, but doesn't resemble the sort of absolute rulers that I would have learned about in school, for example, when I had world history, because they were based on a set of independent cities that had some semblance of collective governance at the local level. They just didn't really have it at the central level. They didn't succeed in maintaining that once they went to a larger scale society. Well, right next to the Aztecs, there was a society that's come to be called the Republic of Tlaxcala, which a number of recent anthropologists and archaeologists have written about, that had a ruling council with no single ruler, that had elections and a process of selection, and that, when Cortez first encountered it, said, wow, this place is organized like a European city-state, like Venice or Genoa, and it's not organized like a monarchy. And so I think that's a fascinating thing. It's also fascinating that you would then have these two very different sorts of societies, one more autocratic and one more democratic, sitting right next to each other. Right? It comes down to the idea that there really can be these two alternate routes as a society develops.
So, what do you think made, if you look at the historical conditions that would have produced one or the other regime type, why did Tlaxcala become a republic while other regions in the area were autocracies? And likewise, why did the Wendat form a kind of democratic confederation when other tribes in those areas also were more autocratic? What produces these different outcomes?
Yeah, so it's tricky when you're talking about individual societies to say, oh, this is why Tlaxcala stayed that way. So what I tried to do in the book was sort of hint at more generalities. I mean, the one we've already talked about was this fact that smaller scale seemed to be more favorable to early democracy, and it was harder to maintain it once you enlarged the scale of a society. Another one would have to do with the style of agriculture that was practiced. If it was an intensive style of agriculture where people were packed into a small area, and they wouldn't have an ability to exit as people practicing slash and burn agriculture would have been. And that made them more dependent on rulers. It also made it easier for rulers to sort of monitor what these people were doing and what they were producing. Whereas, societies like the Wendat Huron or the Iroquois Haudenosaunee had people practicing a style of horticulture and agriculture where if people were really unhappy, they could just sort of melt off into the forest and do their own thing. And I think that fundamentally disciplined the ability of anyone to set themselves up as a sort of paramount chief who would rule with an iron fist without having to seek any sort of consent from others.
Okay, so if we're trying to isolate and compile the factors conducive to democracy, you're saying, so small scale is conducive to democracy. Exit options, so if the people can just pack up and leave if they don't like the rulers, that's conducive to democracy. And what other
So I
features
guess
are we...
the information environment, once rulers get to start collecting revenue, and revenue can be thought of very broadly, not even if you don't have money, rulers may be collecting grain or maize to redistribute it. Then when it's easier for rulers to know what people are producing and what they can get, that made them less dependent upon obtaining information from people about what they could produce and what they could really handle in terms of redistributing goods within the society. So I think those are all factors. And of course, the flip side of people being able to take off was when rulers needed their people, say, to turn out for military service or for warfare or for other things.
So if you have a central bureaucracy that knows every single farm in the land, how much it's capable of producing, and knows all the resources, like every mine, how much gold and silver it can produce and everything, so you have that centralized knowledge, then it's easier to implement an autocratic state. Whereas if you don't know what yonder village can produce and you have to depend on local authorities to tell you and to give you taxes, then you're kind of automatically at a less autocratic position and you have to cooperate more. Is that the gist?
That's exactly right. I mean, it all depends upon whether you're relying on a bureaucrat who you pay and you control to find out this information, or whether you're relying on local people who you ask and who you may discuss things with in the format of a council or an assembly. Then those are sort of two different routes to obtaining the information that you need, but that lead to very different styles of governance.
So I want to ask you a question about this that will take us to the modern period.
Okay.
And to modern democracy. So, you make the case in your book that modern democracy, in contrast to early democracy, owes a lot to the particularities of Anglo-American history, and particularly English history. Now, wouldn't you say that England, of all the states of Europe after the Norman conquest, had a better knowledge of all the different lands and resources? Didn't they have, was it called the Domesday Book or something, where they
had the Domesday Book? That's right.
Okay.
Which they did only once. That's the key thing to remember. That actually they never were able to repeat the success of that. So if they'd done a Domesday Book every 10 years, they could have eventually gotten to the point where they had a large bureaucracy that were just sort of taxed directly, and that was it. But they didn't. I think what happened is the Anglo-Saxon state was actually quite efficient and it was circa the turn of the first millennium, was the only society in Western Europe outside of Muslim Spain that was actually taxing agriculture directly, which is quite a remarkable feature. And I think the Normans benefited from sort of the legacy of the Anglo-Saxons, but that it didn't develop into this sort of bureaucratic, autocratic route. But England's interesting, of course, because it's, as I talk about in the book, it's a relatively strong monarchy compared to a lot of other European monarchies at the time.
Okay, so if we move forward to the 17th century, we see both the Netherlands and Great Britain moving away from just monarchy, and although they still had, kings, they're basically, you could say, republics at that point. They're or parliamentary states or whatever. And you talk about how the English blueprint won over the Dutch blueprint, and the English blueprint was the one that was then influenced America and modern democracy. So why did the English form of parliamentary government lead to modern democracy more than, say, the Dutch system?
Yeah, well, I think that the amazing irony of the Dutch system is that many people have rightly called them the first modern economy in terms of finance, proto-manufacturing, all sorts of things like that, an economic powerhouse before England was. But the Dutch had distinctively antiquated political institutions that were characteristic of early democracy. So, for example, we said with the Huron or the Iroquois that if a tribe wasn't happy with a collective decision, they could just opt out. The same exact thing was true with Dutch cities or Dutch provinces who discussed. And this became a factor when they were trying to wage naval campaigns against the English in the 17th century. And there were cases where they didn't even get enough money and the money agreed upon until the war was actually over, because some people would just say, we're not paying. And so in the end, I think, though, the Dutch Republic was not a very large place, even with that, they had a very early democracy style of system of making decisions, whereas the English did not have that opt-out. As a parliamentary constituency from very, very early on, you did not have the power to just sort of say, oh, we're not going along with this.
Okay, so the British system had a stronger central authority where local communities could not opt out of central decision making. You also talk about how in Britain, you had these parliamentarians, and they could not be sent by their local communities to parliament with a mandate. In other words, local communities couldn't say, okay, you, John, go to London and stick to these principles and do not, you're not allowed to give up on these demands, right? That was not allowed. The local communities had to agree that if the representatives came to parliament, they could make any decision they wanted. So no mandate, which sounds kind of not very democratic, and yet you say that was the secret sauce that allowed the British system to kind of spread around the world. So kind of unpack that for us, if you will.
Well, so there was a tension that existed in a lot of medieval and early modern European states that had representative assemblies, where rulers, kings or queens, were generally always interested in saying, you come and you stay here and we make a decision, and then everybody has to follow it, and that's it. And you therefore can't come with strict instructions from your locality, or especially you can't, once you get here, refer back to your constituents to say, oh no, we need to go back to see if my people would be okay with this change before coming back to the assembly or parliament or whatever it was called. And as you can see, from the point of view of kings and queens, they wanted to avoid the cumbersome nature of this sort of system of mandates and referring back. But of course, it is a somewhat less democratic system in that you have to go along with decisions even if you weren't in the majority, even if you really deeply disagree with them. And so what is exceptional about England is that, while most European rulers were fairly ineffective at achieving this idea of no mandates, in England this happens in the House of Commons from the 1330s. That's sort of the last real case, apart from a very brief moment around the time of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where there's any sense of saying you could refer back to your constituency before coming and making a decision. You had something to do in Parliament, and there was a job to do, and you had to finish it, and that was that. And so that, I think, I'd argue, made for a much more effective and efficient policy-making machine, if you consider sort of the English and the Dutch, where the Dutch are having the system where people have to refer back and say, well, no, we don't want to contribute that much for the building of these ships, whereas the English have already made the decision because they don't have the system of mandates and referring back. That's going to advantage the English, and I think that's one reason why the idea, particularities of English Anglo-American history, again, the story of no mandates gets generalized. So that despite some efforts during the colonial period in the United States to have colonial legislatures that would have mandates or instructions, that went out completely with the Constitution, and likewise with the French Revolution, it was established that no, mandates would not exist.
we talked earlier about how there was a problem of scale in democracies, how smaller societies could more easily implement democracy. So is it fair to say that the elimination of mandates was a kind of compromise that so it's a slight reduction in the overall democraticness of the state, but that actually allows it to scale, and therefore societies that have this compromise can have more effective decision making, and they can win over, like the British can win over the Dutch because they have this more scalable system.
Yeah, I think that's precisely it. And so, it would be lovely if everyone could just say, like, hey, we each do our own thing. But then that's going to pose problems and make decision making cumbersome and ineffective. And so I think you are, with the disappearance of mandates, you were indeed giving up something. But it was something that proved effective. Now, I'm not, establishing a sort of normative case for one or the other. I'm just saying that the two different systems, mandates or no mandates, have very clear advantages and inconveniences, shall we say.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I would like to bind my representatives with mandates. On the other hand, if it means the state will be defeated in a war, it's a tough call,
Right.
But so your book is called The Decline and Rise of Democracy. It's obviously a provocative title, though not many people might know why it's provocative and what it actually means. So, well, I have an idea what it means, but maybe I'll give it to you first to kind of why decline first and then rise.
I'm surprised that with the reception of the book has been good, and I'm surprised that more people did not say, "Oh, shouldn't it be rise and then decline?" Given what we're experiencing today, and I think the idea is that if you scan out and look at a much broader sweep of history, we've had more of a story of a decline and then a rise of two different types of democracy. So early democracy tends to disappear in a lot of places, in part because Europeans conquered and colonized people, and European and early democracy disappeared. But in part also, I think, because it was tough to use the institutions of early democracy and have them be scaled up. Whereas what we've seen with the Anglo-American developments and then the spread of basic principles of modern democracy across the globe, we've seen a rise of a very new type of democracy, at least new in the sense of it's only a few hundred years old. It's not 1,000 or 2,000 years old or even more. And so that's why I speak of that rise. And I think people need to realize that after the democratic waves of the 19th and 20th centuries and after 1989, there are a lot more people living in democracies than before, even if what we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years has been a significant amount of retrenchment.
So just to kind of take what you said and see if I fully grasp it, you classify democracies as falling into two broad categories: early democracy and modern democracy. And you're saying that early democracy was actually widespread. Many communities independently came up with these techniques for a cooperative, decentralized government. But in the modern era, this was kind of replaced by this particularly British innovation of a representative without mandate type democracy, and that proved to be very scalable and effective, and then that was spread to America and then to Europe and then to much of the rest of the world. So that's the kind of subsequent rise of a new kind of democracy that has supplanted the previous kind. Is that the gist of it?
That's correct.
All right. So I want to I want to probe this a little bit, because under your rubric, ancient Greece and arguably Rome fall under early democracy. And someone, a classical scholar like myself might ask you, like, is Athens, for example, is Athens more similar to the Huron Confederacy or to modern America?
And so that's a really interesting question and a tricky one to handle, because the Athenian example is exceptional in terms of the breadth of participation for, as long as you weren't a slave and as long as you were a man and not a woman, and exceptional degree of participation in a society that actually for a Greek polis was pretty large. Given that, you know this better than me, but from what I understand, a typical Greek polis was much smaller than Athens was. So that I think itself is sort of exceptional, and they managed to make things work at scale in a way on their own. But in terms of the intensive feature, for those who were able to participate, I think it's a lot closer to the Huron than to America today, in the sense of that if you had the right to participate among the Huron or in Athens, this was something you did frequently. It was not basically like you only voted every few years, which is for most people in the United States today. And this is another feature of modern democracy that may make it work, but has inconveniences. You're only really voting, every few years, say, and that for most people, that's not. Most people don't participate politically actively more directly in any other way.
Part of the reason I'm asking is that you could arguably see the same kind of trend that you outline over thousands of years in your book. You could make the case that it plays out also across the first millennium BC, where, in the 5th century BC, you have this radical democracy of Athens. And over the next few centuries, this is something that I've gotten out of discussions with Matt Simonton, for example, who wrote Ancient Greek Oligarchy.
Right.
And so there's this ideological battle between oligarchy and democracy basically wins during the Hellenistic period, 3rd century, 2nd century BC. However, those democracies are not nearly as radically democratic as the earlier ones. And then when you get to Rome, which I think under your system would be called early democracy, it has a lot of oligarchic and even some monarchic flavors to it. So you could say that just as the Anglo-American system, which has these compromises like no mandates, etc., but was more scalable, supplanted like the Dutch model in the modern period, a similar trend happened in the ancient Mediterranean, where there were these over time, there were these compromises and reductions in certain democratic processes that allowed the republics of the period to scale and become more competitive.
Yeah, because, coming back to the Athenian model, you think of this was a wonderful experiment in collective governance that worked for a long time. But ultimately, when you talk about making that operate at larger scale than existed, it relies upon a large number of people participating very frequently in politics by gathering in a place in Athens, participating in the ecclesia. And that is a system that is difficult to make work over a really broad swath of territory, as in larger than the territory in the Attic Peninsula that Athens covered. And ultimately, it gets you to a situation where the only alternative then is to say, well, people who are in this city or people who can make it to the ecclesia are participating, but other people become sort of subjects that they don't have any political, they're not able to participate politically because they're too far away.
Right.
And I do think that the Roman system obviously seems to have been more effective at operating across a much larger scale. But then, exactly as you're referring to, you see this transformation of something becoming inherently less democratic as you operate at larger scale.
So, you're basically proposing a new taxonomy, a new categorization that's challenging the traditional categorization. And, there's going to be pros and cons to each system. And I'm glad that you're doing this because, I think that all these ideas should be constantly challenged. But the other potential objection some people might have is, we have this very rich vocabulary that we've inherited from the Greeks and Romans, right? Where we talk about democracy, republic, oligarchy, aristocracy, federation, confederation, and a lot of those systems under your rubric would be classified under early democracy. So is there a danger that we might be losing some nuances that we had under the traditional taxonomy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first initial point I wanted to make in this book was just the distinction between autocracy and early democracy, and get people to realize that and really hit that point home by finding as much evidence as I could. But then, absolutely, within the set of polities that we might call early democracies, there was a tremendous variation in the degree of popular input into politics, into the way that things were organized. And I would not deny that at all. I would say that's an interesting question then, is to say, unpacking different types of early democracy and how would you like to see them? And there must be a range of arrangements from, in some cases, the most decentralized, just go it on your own places, to places where things are a bit more centralized and participation was perhaps a little bit more restricted.
Right. Okay, I see. So I'd like to go back to the historical factors and circumstances that seem to give rise to democracy of any sort, and we talked about exit options. We talked about how much the central authorities know about local resources. There are also some kind of traditional arguments that you take issue with in your book. So, for example, there's been a long-standing theory that wealth is conducive to democracy. So, and coming at this from the ancient Greek and Roman perspective, that seems to check out. Like all the Greek polis that were democratic were basically wealthier than the other polis, and then in the Renaissance, the Italian city-states that were republican were wealthier per capita than the larger monarchies. So what's the problem with that picture, I guess? I mean,
okay, so there's several potential problems with that picture. The one, most important being that wealth and democracy could go along without that being a causal relationship necessarily. There could be sort of deeper reasons why certain societies on a certain trajectory are likely to both be wealthier and more democratic without wealth causing democracy. I think the main issue with some of the work that's been done in the last sort of 60 years or so on this subject for modern economies takes the view of saying, well, look, Europe is much richer than Latin America, and there are more democracies in Europe than in Latin America, or something like that. So this is what Seymour Martin Lipset first did in a famous publication in 1959. And the problem with that was that you shouldn't be looking at Europe and Latin America in the 1950s as he was, and using sort of current data. What you need, if you want to understand the role of wealth and modernity more generally in leading to democracy, you need to look at that at the time that a society first democratized or first had a chance to democratize. And if you compare a country like France in 1870, when they established a universal suffrage in a durable fashion, it was a country that, by today's standards, was very poor, that had a GDP in current real terms of something like $2,000 per person. So that's on the same level of a country like Tanzania today, right? So a lot of countries that are stable democracies today, when they democratized, were very, very poor by contemporary standards. And so to me, that makes me raise questions about whether I'm not saying that there's not a link. There may be a link between wealth and democracy, but that makes me ask questions about whether you have to be wealthy to be a stable democracy. And, we have cases in Africa today, like Ghana, for example, that's a stable democracy, but is not a wealthy country by international standards. And that, seems durable for the moment.
You're making kind of cross-temporal wealth comparisons, and I'm wondering if maybe relative wealth might play a role. So, like, was when France made its first steps towards democracy, was it wealthier per capita than, Poland at the time? And the reason I'm asking this is that if you look at these three kind of traditionally talked about waves of non-monarchical states, so ancient Greek, polis, Italian city-states in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and then modern North Atlantic seaboard democracies. In all those three cases, you have these clusters of states that are much wealthier per capita than the bigger empires and kingdoms of the time, even though those bigger empires and kingdoms might have been wealthier overall, right? You have these kind of enterprising clusters of states where there's a more, I guess, mobilized middle class, if you will, that's commercial and mercantile and so forth. So, yeah, I'm just wondering if the wealth factor in that sense, in the sense of relative per capita wealth, might be an important one.
I mean, I think it could be for, coming back to the Florentine example, one thing that's very useful about having a lot of wealth is that you can maintain your autonomy and not be conquered by a prince. And that's the case of a lot of European city-states that are able to do that. So there could be multiple channels through which wealth matters. There's different explanations. There could be that you can defend yourself. It could be that wealth comes with elements of modernity that connect people, like telephones and motor vehicles and things like that. That's sort of one element of what Lipset would have said. But I don't think that one's accurate because, again, coming back to France in 1870, no telephones, no motor vehicles. Or there could be some other unforeseen factor that just means that wealth itself of a society makes its members more inclined to want to be governed or want themselves to have a role in governance in a way that would not exist if this was a poorer society. And that's plausible, but I think more needs to be done to show that directly.
Okay. And the final factor I wanted to ask you about is the need to mobilize troops, and external threats. If a society has external threats and needs to mobilize troops, is that a factor conducive to democracy?
Yes, but it depends upon the state of military technology. So it depends upon what war you're fighting against who and whether that dictates mobilization of the masses or whether that speaks instead in favor of a smaller scale mobilization where you have a much more capital intensive form of warfare.
And the latter type would be like knights in shining armor?
Right. So there's this interesting, the old Lynn White story that the invention of the iron stirrup led to feudalism in Western Europe, which has been, it's such an interesting and fascinating story. People debate whether it's actually right or not. Some people love the argument, some people hate it, but it's an interesting example of how it could work that way. The idea is that the iron stirrup allows knights to position themselves with heavy armor and, and a lance and things like that in a way that earlier, more primitive stirrups did not. And so you get this format of having warfare being waged by smaller armies of people who have a lot, enough money to maintain and equip a war horse. So that clearly does not lead to democracy because that's not something that involves broad mobilization. But then in later centuries, when you have broader mobilization of the populace, I think it's quite convincing that, around the turn of the 20th century, you see these explicit arguments of saying, well, if we're going to be mobilized to fight, if there's going to be universal conscription, then there should also be universal suffrage.
I see. So the technological conditions on the ground might make it so that mobilization will only be for relatively wealthy people who can afford, the fancy equipment needed to fight. But in the particular moments when you need, when anybody can just grab a crossbow and go to the front, that's when it's conducive to democracy, because then you actually need like the whole people to.
That's right.
To be mobilized. Okay. All right. Well, let's bring it to today. You have this broad perspective of thousands of years of democracy across many continents, and we're living in a time when people have questions about the longevity of democracy, about the sustainability of democracy. What what are some of the biggest lessons you think people can take from your book, from the study of democracy, early and modern, that can help us navigate the troubled waters that we seem to be in right now?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of lessons. I mean, I think one of them is that if you look at the range of ways that people have governed themselves more or less democratically over the centuries, there have been a lot of different innovations and investments. And I think in the West, we got a bit complacent, particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union, and assuming that the current style of Western democracy was the end state of things and the most logical way to organize things. And that therefore we stopped thinking about A, should it ever need to be modified? And B, do you need to do anything in addition to keep even that system going? Like, for example, having civic education so that people are more likely to support the idea of certain norms that are necessary for democracy to be maintained. And so I think we've lost a lot by not thinking about what we need to do sort of day in, day out to work on democracy to maintain it.
So it sounds like democracy is, to use an ancient phrase, a ship of state, and you need to maintain it. You need to put in repeated investments into its functioning. Is that the...
That's exactly it, I believe, because otherwise and I think this was realized by a number of the more foresighted of the founding fathers in the U.S. after the ratification of the Constitution, is, in such a big place, you need to do something so that people actually feel connected with government. And given the low levels of trust in government that we see today, I'm not sure that people really feel that connection in a lot of cases, and that's problematic.
So how can we increase trust?
Well, there are various questions that get into nitty-gritty things, but that are actually really important, like local newspapers. Is it important to have a local press? Because a local press tends to be less partisan and more trusted than a national press is. And so you somehow feel like you're participating and like you're connected. Again, coming back to the issue of civic education. I mean, would it have been something which should more have been done to invest in that? Now, the problem with that, of course, is that's a very long-term proposition, because if you start educating people in a new way today, it's only once they reach adulthood that their new ideas or norms that they adhere to will have an effect, and it's only after decades that have a general effect on the population, the adult population as a whole. So I think those are the kind of things that we need to think about. We also need to think about ways in which some early democracies thought about how to avoid polarization by having sort of cross-cutting links between different groups. Coming back to the case of the Huron and the Iroquois, they had tribes, but then they had clans that cross-cut these tribes, so that you could be a member of a certain clan, and the same member, someone else could be in your clan even if you weren't in the same tribe. So that's the same idea was tried in Athens with Cleisthenes, with his reorganization of the creation of 10 tribes in Athens that weren't geographically distinct.
This is awesome. I love this, because just to clarify for our listeners, these clans and tribes were not actually clans and tribes. They were called that to appeal to common notions that people had, but they were actually ingenious groupings that brought people of different clans and tribes together, right? That's the general principle. So the Athenian tribes were fake tribes that brought people of often hostile tribes to actually have a dialogue.
Right, and so and you can say among the Huron and the Iroquois, the same idea is there, and that being same member of the same clan, which is also an invention, right? If it's like called the Wolf Clan or something like that, that's an invention, right? And if you think of, so two societies as different as Athens and the Huron come up with a very similar idea, there must be something to that.
Yeah. So maybe we can have like a student exchange program between blue and red states, so that people have.
Yeah, or again, coming back to the mundane thing of, decades ago, you didn't really. Well, you don't choose your college roommate today, but there are cases where you fill out a pretty long list of preferences. It's kind of like, dial a roommate or whatever. Here's and it wasn't that way back in the day. When you went to college, it was just like, nope, you were rooming with someone else and you had no control over who they were. And so it often wound up that you wound up with someone from, a different part of the country who had a very different life and very different experience from you. And that was helpful for, getting outside of your own little tribe, as it were.
All right, last question. Using your crystal ball, what do you think about the future of democracy?
I feel like the future of democracy itself is bright. What about the future of our democracy? I'm not so sure. And I think the reason for that is that a lot of people have in mind this idea of the sort of the torch theory of democracy, that it started in Athens, then it got handed off to Renaissance city republics, and then somewhere in England, and then into America. And that if the torch goes out, then that's it, democracy is done. But I mean, as we discussed, democracy broadly construed is something that a tremendous number of human societies have experienced and practiced over time. So I see no reason why that's going to change. But it's certainly the case that our own democracy is ailing, and we should be less confident in our own democracy than we were just 10 or 20 years ago because of the challenges that face us. And maybe if we look at practices from other democracies that we don't usually refer to, we might just think of ways in which we could creatively address some of the problems we're facing today.
David Stasavage, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Jack.